You know, I've always envied those women on that Easter morning, in part because for them, resurrection was real. I mean, let's imagine. They come, and then there's an earthquake, and then an angel of the Lord comes down, rolls away the stone, sits on the stone, and then announces to them that Jesus is risen. I don't know about you, but if I had that kind of experience, resurrection would be a lot more real to me than it is many times. It's hard for us to believe in resurrection. It's hard for us. Now, I'm not talking about some intellectual assent to the idea of resurrection. It's difficult for us, we who live in this rational, scientific, empirical world, to grasp something like resurrection intellectually, rationally. That's difficult. Many ways, for many of us, we might attribute the idea of resurrection to some superstitious folks in the past, to some myth, to some legend. But I'm not talking about resurrection in that intellectual sense. It's interesting, though, more and more scientists and cosmologists and physicists are pointing out something very interesting about the cosmos around us, about the world. One thing they assert, many of them assert, is nothing ever disappears. It doesn't go away. It may change from one form to another, from matter to energy to matter. But many would assert that the very things that were part of creation at the Big Bang, the very elements, the very molecules, the very things that existed at that time are what exactly exist in us today. We're made up of those very things that were there at the beginning of time. In a way, they say, we're stardust. It's an interesting idea. And in many ways, some of the ancestors that we might call superstitious, in many ways, they were much more in tune with this idea of death and resurrection. I mean, in many ways, they were closer to nature. They saw it, the sun die each night, the sun rise in the morning. The very cycle of nature, which is winter and spring and summer and fall, death and resurrection all around us, all they did was see it, and they told stories about it. Buddhists for thousands of years have engaged in a meditation practice, many spiritual writers, but they will talk about this experience that Buddhists will retreat and sit down and meditate. You might wonder what they're meditating. I've been on a meditation retreat. I spent most of the time meditating how I could get out of there. But the reality is you're supposed to meditate. What you pay attention to is this that they assert is reality. Is how experience rises and dies. That at the very essence of human interaction with the world is this experience of death and resurrection. That if I notice a pain arising in my knee, if I don't resist it, if I don't fight it, if I just pay attention to it, I will notice on its own it will rise and it will die. So death and resurrection are all around us. But you know what? We find it hard to believe in resurrection. Maybe the reality is it's so easy to see death, you know? It's so easy to open our papers, turn on our television, hear the news of chemical attack in Syria, of people dying all over the world. It's just so easy to see that kind of death. So easy maybe to know someone who's going through a horrible addiction and the death, the dying that is part of that addiction. Or maybe it's so easy to see death in a broken relationship, that heart-rending heartbrokenness that happens when a relationship is broken in and of itself, the dying of that. Or it may just be as simple as we know that those we love the longest, parents and grandparents, they pass away. Death is easy to believe in because it's right there in front of us. You know, an interesting fact is that during the time of Jesus, the Greeks and Romans had no trouble believing in resurrection. They had really no trouble with that. In fact, that was part of their worldview. There were many stories in Greek and Roman times of heroes who were raised from the dead and became gods. In fact, that was, in many ways, a common theme. So it wasn't resurrection they struggled with. What they struggled with was that they would complain, that there was this one man, this nameless criminal, heretic, treason person from the backwaters of the empire. There's this unnamed peasant that now all of a sudden they're claiming has been raised from the dead. Caesar for sure, but Jesus from Galilee? That's hard to believe in resurrection. They wouldn't believe in that. What's interesting about that is that not only do we find it hard to believe in the resurrection, but the story we read this morning, who's the first people who received the news that Jesus was raised? It was the three women. Now, women, of course, in that Jewish society at the time, were powerless. They weren't even allowed to testify in court. They were lumped with undesirables and deaf mutes. They were not allowed to testify in Jewish courts, and they're the ones who see Jesus raised from the dead. And there's this little odd line at the end of that passage in which Jesus tells these three women, "Tell my brothers and sisters that I will see them in Galilee." Now, that seems an odd line, but the truth is Galilee was kind of the backwaters empire. It was backwaters. It was a small town. It was nothing. Now, I would expect Jesus to show up in Rome or the temple, show himself, but why go to Galilee? There's an old joke I was telling some friends. Bishop comes into the Pope and says, "I've got good news and bad news." And the Pope says, "Well, what's the good news?" He says, "Jesus has returned, and he's on the phone, and he wants to talk to you." Well, and the Pope says, "Whatever could be the bad news?" "Well, he's calling from Salt Lake City." Resurrection happens among the strangest people, the most common everyday people, and in the strangest and most common everyday cities. So what I think is that resurrection is not something you believe in. It's not. Resurrection is something we experience. It's like love. It'd be silly for me to ask you, do you believe in love? Wouldn't it? It has to be experienced. And resurrection happens in our lives every day in the smallest ways and in the strangest places and out there among the strangest people. We are people of the resurrection. We look, we search, and we see in each other the risen Lord. And every time we say to each other, Alleluia, the Lord is risen, we see in each other the light of Christ, who has been raised in our hearts and minds and who is present in the love shared in this community and out in the world. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.